Good evening and welcome to BizFest in Focus. Our guest tonight is the Honourable Eran Wickramaratne MP. Mr. Wickramaratne, thank you very much for joining us on BizFest in Focus. It's a pleasure having you with us.
Thank you.
To start things off, Mr. Wickramaratne, I want to ask you now, there's been a lot of opinions that have been floated around about the 2013 budget, and you have to admit a lot of these opinions that are coming are quite positive. What are on a macro perspective, what are your opinions on the 2013 budget?
I think like in every budget, there are positives and there are negatives. And I think that one needs to really look at the budget and the fiscal side in the context of the larger economy. If you look at the fiscal side of the budget deficit, they said last year was going to be 6.9%. and it was going to be 6.2% this year, and it's going to be 5.8% next year. Now, if you were to take these numbers on face value, then as you said, it begins to look positive. But actually you need to go much deeper. If you look at that number, 6.9% budget deficit in 2011, actually the deficit is much bigger. With data you have to be extremely careful, because several games can be played with data. And I think unfortunately in recent years some of the numbers coming out of the central authorities are questionable.
Why do you say that these numbers are questionable?
Yeah, I'll give you an example. If you look at the budget deficit, for example, it says the budget deficit in 2011 is 6.9. Actually the budget deficit is 8.9. And the reason I say it's 8.9 is, deficits can be actually hidden or parked in different places. So we need to look at the consolidated deficit of the government. The government, as you know, signed the standby facility with the IMF, and the last tranche was in July 2012.
Yes,
and that's right. During that tranche, both sides at the end of the discussion signed the usual letter. And if you look at that document, and you can see this if you go into the IMF website, look at Sri Lanka, look at the July letter, you will see in the table there that the 6.9, and in the footnote says it does not include the losses of the Ceylon Electricity Board and the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation. They have been taken out. So if you put the losses back, which is a central government deficit, then it goes to 8.9. So there are very ingenious and clever ways.
So the losses of the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation and the Electricity Board alone account for 2% of the deficit.
That's right.
From 6.9 to 8.9.
That's right. It goes from 6.9 to 8.9, and it's a huge, not to nearly 2% difference. It's a huge difference. The losses of these corporations have grown enormously. Like Ceylon Electricity Board has gone from about 19 billion to about 45 billion this year. And the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation losses are not known. Last year it was nearly 85 billion rupees. And this does not include the recent losses on the hedging contracts and things like that, which I would estimate would add another 40 billion plus interest. So losses are things that could actually be hidden in ingenious ways. The government is clearly managing its ratios, but the health of an economy doesn't just depend on its ratios. We need to look much deeper at it. Look at the 2012 number. It said it's 6.2% when it presented the budget last year as an estimate. When the President came to Parliament and he made his budget speech, he said it will be 6.2 as well. Now the question I have is, when the budget speech was made last year and the 6.2 was estimated, they said that revenue will grow at 18%.
But revenue has not grown at 18%.
Revenue has grown at 10%. Right? So then you begin to wonder, how on earth are you going to be keeping the same budget deficit when your revenue is almost half, the growth rate is almost half of what you actually predicted. So there are clearly issues about that. If you look at next year's figures, which was projected from this budget speech, it says it's going to come to 5.8%. So I think there are problems on revenue for sure, right? Another statistic that they are fond of quoting is that, from 5 years ago, poverty declined from 15% to 10%. If poverty did actually decline, then people would be basically wage earners. The tax net should increase. The number of taxpayers should increase. There should be an increase in the tax revenue.
In tax revenue.
In government revenue. And we are not basically saying that. So I think that that's one of the big challenges that we have. The next thing that we need to look at is on the expenditure side. Expenditure is basically going on. There has been some reining in of capital expenditure probably in the last few months, maybe an attempt to try to get some level of fiscal consolidation. And therefore, I think it's usually predictable in a Sri Lankan budget that revenue is overestimated and expenditure is underestimated. So the deficit is generally much, much larger. There are implications of this, right? So on the fiscal side, you have that. The other big challenge I think that you need to look at it is the government is predicting high growth rates.
They're targeting reaching the 8% mark in the near future.
That's right.
Again.
That's right. And as you know, after the 2009 end of the military conflict, we had the benefit basically of the northeastern economy being integrated into the Sri Lankan economy. And we had, if you want, the peace dividend. So we had 2 years of relatively strong growth and 8% growth.
A lot of economists at present have just put down that 8% growth to a post-war boom. And they said it's very common in a lot of countries that are coming out of conflict. For example, even Sierra Leone at the end of their civil war, Sierra Leone in Africa, they also had a similar post-war boom, but they have been unable in recent times to get back to that growth rate. Do you think Sri Lanka will be able to get back to that 8% growth rate?
No, I think the challenge is sustainability. You know, as you correctly said, it was the question about, you know, post-conflict you get a high return. The question is how do you actually maintain, you know, that growth rate. They predicted 8 last year and it's now dropping closer to 6. They're predicting 7.5, and it's going to be a huge challenge getting anywhere near that 7.5. You see, we have a huge investment gap in this country, what we save and what we invest. It's a huge gap. Just to give you a very illustrative example, in China, the savings are more like 52%. In India, it's like 33%. In Vietnam, it's 29%. In Malaysia, it's 39%. These are huge savings rate. Sri Lanka is only 15%. China and India with those very, very high savings rates are talking of growth rates which are only about 9%. Sri Lanka is talking about 7.5 and 8 with 15% savings.
We'll leave our audience those huge numbers to think about for a little while. We'll be right back after this short break. Welcome back to the show. Now, Mr. Wickramaratne, before we left off a note, we were talking about these massive losses that are being incurred by government corporate public enterprise, basically. I also want to draw your attention to another point. Now, recently in Parliament, you challenged the legality of the 2013 budget. Would you care to elaborate on this?
I will, but I just want to conclude the previous discussion on government losses. What it means to the common person is that every time you go out to the supermarket, every time you go out to your boutique, whatever item you buy, you're paying taxes. So it is you who is paying for those losses. You know, sometimes people are detached from these large numbers, but it's when you buy your onions, your potatoes, your canned fish, you know, whatever you buy, you're basically paying for it. So the ordinary person is funding these losses. Coming to the question you just posed to me,
the legality of the budget.
On the legality of the budget. As you know, there have been some interesting determinations recently by the Supreme Court of the country. There are particularly 3, I would say, fairly important things that are going on at the moment. One was on the Divi Neguma bill, right? When the Supreme Court ruled that 11 of the provisions of the bill
were in violation of the Constitution.
Yes, inconsistent with the Constitution. Now, Sri Lanka must be the only country in the world where we have a Constitution, and there's a provision in the Constitution which says if you want to violate the Constitution, this is the way to violate it, right? So a government which has a 2/3 majority can always say, forget the Constitution, we want the bill through, we will use our 2/3 majority. In some situations, the Supreme Court might specify that in addition to the 2/3 majority, that you have to go and actually obtain a referendum, and the will of the people need to be ascertained. But these are unusual provisions in the Constitution. I think the debate in the country today is about, particularly with the attempt to impeach the Chief Justice of the country, is, that the country has to uphold the principle of the rule of law. It's not the rule of men, you see. It's a sovereignty of the people. You see, it's people who are sovereign. We are all creatures of the Constitution, including the legislation. Including the legislation is a creation of the Constitution. And clearly there has to be a separation of powers, and this separation of powers must be jealously guarded. And each, the executive, the legislature and the judiciary, needs to be careful that we respect each other's powers if we actually to preserve a democratic society as we have known it. I can say this, these are very disturbing signs, and the country is drifting towards a constitutional dictatorship, and therefore we need to be extremely careful. Coming to the particular question,
the budget, yes,
the appropriations bill, it was also challenged basically in court, and when it was challenged, and it was a bench of the Supreme Court, 3 members, didn't include other judges, eminent judges of the court, basically pronounced that the appropriation bill was also in some respects inconsistent with the Constitution. And there were particularly 2 provisions that were inconsistent with the Constitution. That was, one was 2(1)(b), and 2(1)(b) dealt with basically, as a practice, appropriation bill puts a borrowing limit, you see, and the borrowing limit has been stated. But the question was asked in terms of Article 148
of the Constitution,
yes, and 149(50) or so talks more about it, where Parliament is given full control of finance.
Fiscal authority,
full control of finance. Then Parliament has the right to know not just the limit on borrowing, but who do we borrow from, the source of funding. The judgment called it, Parliament is the eye on finance. So what's the source of funding? How much are we borrowing? From where are we borrowing? What are the interest rates are we borrowing? What are the terms of the engagement? Right? Parliament has a right to know these things. And the court said that Parliament, as per Article 76 of the Constitution, cannot abdicate its responsibility on financial control. Neither could Parliament delegate its legislative power to any other authority it might set up. So it was a very clear judgment. Then there was another provision, and that was 7(b). And in 7(b), you see, basically what it does is, we pass the budget, we pass estimates, and sometimes the money we have passed on a particular head doesn't get utilized under that head, and therefore it can be shifted. And that discretionary power has been given, the minister takes it through the appropriations bill. And the court ruled that no, we cannot actually delegate our responsibility, that responsibility remains with Parliament. And therefore the bill, at least in these 2 respects, is inconsistent with the Constitution. So I actually, when I was doing my response to the budget, I spoke about it on Friday, and I had no response from the government. Nobody really commented on what I had said. And then on Saturday, when the vote was about to be taken,